Hey, what is up? So for this video, gonna review the 7th episode of Season 5 of Better Call Saul, entitled JMM. Really looking forward to reviewing these final 4 episodes of Season 5 before the premiere of Season 6 in just a few weeks from now. But anyway, without any further delay, let's review this episode. Alright, so the cold opening scene of this episode is a continuation of where the previous episode left off. We're following Kim telling Jimmy that they could get married. We see them, likely the next day, outside of the courthouse discussing the parameters of this agreement, where the two characters discuss that they want full disclosure between the two of them, no more secrets. That's the point of this agreement. Again, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that this is a legal agreement, so if Saul gets in trouble, Kim does not have to testify against him because they have spousal privilege. Saul says as much to Huel Babineau later in this scene where we see Huel, after sort of questioning why Saul is getting married, insinuating that is Kim pregnant because there's really no other reason why he would do this. Saul then, as I just stated, tells Huel that this is a legal arrangement, much to Huel's sort of surprise, sort of even straight up asking, "You're getting married for that?" Anyway, this scene basically culminates with these two characters getting married, and that's the sort of totality of this scene. And there's a lot of little details here, and I really can't break all of them down in this review. You really have to go back and watch this scene. But the one part of this cold opening scene that I really want to focus on is the fact that the creators have displayed to us that the canon that was originally displayed in the deleted scene in Breaking Bad in season 3 by Saul Goodman, that he was married 3 times, has now been confirmed in this episode, where it's revealed to us that Kim is Saul Goodman's 3rd wife, aka Jimmy McGill's 3rd wife. Because in this scene, as part of this sort of legal parameters in order to make this official, the clerk working at the marriage department asked Saul for his previous 2 dissolutions, meaning his previous 2 divorces, thus confirming that Saul was married 3 times. It was actually pretty interesting. I remember during season 1 of Better Call Saul, during one of the episodes of the Insider podcast, they were talking about having to, adhere to the strict canon of Breaking Bad in order for there to not be a lot of continuity errors and plot holes. And I even remember as much as Vince Gilligan saying, "But don't hold us to deleted scenes." And of course, he didn't say it outright, but I'm pretty almost positively sure he was referring to that notorious deleted scene, which was a total throwaway dialogue by Saul Goodman at the time and wasn't even put into Breaking Bad as a series. But at the end of the day, nonetheless, the creators decided, you know what, we're going to adhere to a canon even in the deleted scene, which is pretty awesome in my opinion. So now I guess it's pretty much confirmed that Saul's first wife was his wife who slept with Chet as part of the infamous Chicago sunroof story that we heard about in season 1 of Better Call Saul. I believe in the episode entitled Marco. Saul's second wife was the wife who he caught sleeping with his stepdad, if I remember correctly, from season 3 of Breaking Bad in the episode entitled Green Light. And finally, the third wife, who we have yet to know as of this point in the timeline of Better Call Saul, appears to be Kim Wexler. So again, pretty interesting confirmation of the canon here. Now, interesting going back to that deleted scene, while Saul said he was married 3 times, he never said he was divorced 3 times. The dialogue is vague enough where it's theoretically possible that he's still married to Kim at that point in time in the timeline of Breaking Bad. Again, we're just speculating here, but really cool to see this canon adhered to. Alright, so following the cold opening scene, Act 1, Scene 1 then picks up with a continuation of this marriage ceremony where outside the Bernalino County Courthouse we see Jimmy and Kim discussing, Kim telling Jimmy that she can't go out to lunch right now, she has to get back to work, foreshadowing the scene of Mesa Verde that will happen later in this act. Then, following Jimmy saying that he'll be home early and that they'll see each other at home, we then see, which was occurring during this cold opening scene, which I forgot to discuss, that we saw in that cold opening scene, Saul continuously get phone calls, but of course was hanging up his phone because he was preoccupied with Kim getting married. Then finally answering the phone, we hear on the other line is Nacho Varga. Nacho Varga says to Jimmy, "I've been calling you," telling Nacho that he had a busy morning. Nacho then tells Saul, aka Jimmy, to go to lockup because his client is there. Jimmy wondering who got picked up this time. Nacho telling him it's Jorge de Guzman. Saul confused as who this is, saying, "Who the hell is Jorge de Guzman?" Nacho saying, "Who do you think?" Thus ending the first scene in this act which is a direct continuation of the next scene in this act where we see Jimmy in court and we see his client Jorge de Guzman come into screen, and it's then revealed to us that this unknown character at the time, but pretty much implied here, is none other than Lalo Salamanca. So in this scene during Lalo's original arraignment hearing, we see him pleading not guilty to all the charges and having bail denied. Again, that's what happens pretty much here in this scene. Again, foreshadowing what is to come between these two characters all over the course of this episode. Then, following this, the next scene in Act 1 then picks up with Kim and Rich Schweigert at Kevin Wachtel's office at Mesa Verde. Here we see them sort of apologize to Kevin about what transpired over the course of this season with Saul Goodman and with Mr. Acker. Again, apologizing for the lack of professionalism and all of the ordeals that Kevin and Mesa Verde had to go through. Kevin, while listening to the spiel, as well as Paige, sort of affirming their position that besides this one incident in Tucumcari, the legal work has been flawless with Kim and with Schweigert and Coakley. Kevin sort of telling Kim here that she really dropped the ball on this one, sort of insinuating that, this legal sort of agreement between them may terminate after this, even going so far as to tell Kim she can do better than this sort of Saul Goodman character who, really took them for a ride here, legally speaking. Of course, following this meeting and not really seeming as though this relationship is going to stand the test of time, this is sort of going to be a breaking point between Mesa Verde and Schweigert and Coakley, following Kim and Rich leaving. So Kim decides here that instead of just leaving it on a bad note, she decides to go back in and sort of tell Kevin that, despite everything that happened, reminding him that he did not listen to their legal advice of all the things they recommended in respect to Mr. Acker, such as moving the call center and not continuing with the meeting when Saul Goodman was acting in bad faith. Again, a sort of real I'd almost say, for lack of a better term, sort of a sort of badass sort of argument here by Kim Wexler, sort of being very assertive and very dominant here with Kevin sort of spinning it around back on him. Again, not in a sort of mean way or a sort of rude way, just a sort of very matter-of-fact, assertive way. And of course, this argument sort of gets Kevin to sort of get what she's saying here and then sort of let bygones be bygones, and at the end of this meeting say, all right, see you next week. Again, insinuating that despite this, their legal arrangement will continue. And so, yeah, a lot of things happening in this scene. First of all, pretty much closes the chapter here on the sort of Mesa Verde plot that ensued over the course of this season. Also really kind of begins to display to us the very sort of, like I said, sort of very dominant, assertive Kim Wexler here. Again, that's been building over the course of Better Call Saul, and especially this season. Alright, so following this, the final scene in Act 1 then picks up with Saul and Lalo and Lockup discussing the details of their case. And interestingly, I actually discussed the intricate details of this scene in a previous video, but it's kind of interesting here to sort of see Lalo ask Saul about this JMM moniker on his briefcase. I discussed that in a previous video. But anyway, in this scene, we see Saul going over the details of the case, sort of saying, based on the charges here and the evidence, that he should take a plea deal. Of course, Lalo's saying, no, you're going to get me out on bail. Saul saying, basically insinuating that this is not possible based on the circumstances here. This is then followed by Lalo saying, do you want to be a friend of the cartel? Sort of insinuating, if you get me out of this situation, there's a lot of money to be made here for you. Again, and at the time, while we don't know how Saul would be able to do this, it is revealed later in this episode how Saul is able to get Lalo out on bail here. Alright, so following this, Act 2 then picks up with Mike Ehrmantraut at his daughter-in-law's house, Stacy, reading The Little Prince, which is the book he bought in the previous episode, to his granddaughter, Kaylee. So basically, this scene sort of shows us that Mike has reconciled with his family, and following the sort of R&R he had in Mexico in Gus Fring's speech, he outright tells his daughter-in-law that he's decided to play the hand that he's dealt. Again, sort of establishing to us the sort of on good terms relationship Mike had with his family, the sort of dust-up he had where he yelled at Kaylee following him having to kill Werner Ziegler. That's water under the bridge. He's on good terms with his family. And that pretty much sums up the premise of this scene here. Alright, so following this, the next scene in this act then picks up at night with Jimmy and Kim back at their apartment after getting married. Kim sort of telling Jimmy, how did your day go? At this point in time, not telling her about what happened between him and Lalo, instead just saying he got married. And then following Jimmy and Kim proceeding to consummate their marriage here, this is then interrupted by Saul telling Kim that he has the urge to tell her something but doesn't want to and is afraid she's not going to like what she hears. Again, this then proceeds to display to us Saul telling Kim what happened between him and Lalo, telling him that if he was able to get him out on bail, despite the outstanding circumstances, he would be a friend of the cartel, as Lalo said, meaning big money, meaning a lot of publicity for Saul. Kim sort of telling Jimmy here, do you want to be a friend of the cartel though? Just reaffirming the sort of what he's saying here and what he's truly saying and what this really means by him helping Lalo here. Of course, Saul's saying no. Again, not probably telling the complete truth here, probably very much telling a half truth where part of him would want to go down this route in life. I mean, this is a man who's eventually going to put his face on bus benches and billboards and television commercials all over town. He definitely wants that publicity, and he definitely probably wants that money as well and that excitement. But of course, at the time, telling Kim no here in this scene. And Kim, following this, sort of happy that Saul was able to share this part of his life without having to worry about having to testify against him ever because they now have spousal privilege, which pretty much sums up this second scene in Act 2. Then following this, the next scene in this act then picks up with Lalo in jail, sort of just lying here, just, doing nothing. This is then followed by a knock at his jail cell door and a cell phone sliding underneath the door. Again, a funny scene here where his top bunkmate sort of looks down and Lalo sort of shoos him away. This is then followed by Lalo placing a phone call to an unknown person at the time. It's then revealed to us that this is Nacho Varga, of course. Lalo sort of asking about the day-to-day operations of the cartel on the streets. At the end of the scene, we then see Lalo saying to Nacho that he has something for him to do for him. This is then followed by the final scene in this act of Nacho meeting with Mike following this conversation, telling Mike that he's not telling him shit until they talk about his father. Now that Lalo's out of the picture, of course, Nacho says his piece here, saying he's done, saying he wants out for his father as well, because if he runs and his father doesn't, they're just going to go after his father. Nacho sort of asking Mike, does he have a way here to help him out of the situation and square it with Fring? Without Mike giving Nacho a direct answer, he asked Nacho what he's holding out, what information that Lalo told him he's not telling Mike at the time. Nacho telling Mike that Lalo called him from jail and put him in charge while he was in jail, telling him that he wants him to burn down Los Pollos Hermanos. Mike, following hearing this information, telling Nacho that he's not out of the picture then, thus driving away and not further discussing him wanting out with his father, thus ending this scene here in Act 2, and thus ending this act in this episode as well. Then, following this, Act 3, Scene 1, then picks up at a new interesting location where it's revealed to us that it appears a meeting is going on in the restaurant division of Madrigal Electromotive in Houston, Texas. We see a bunch of restaurant CEOs discussing their quarterly performance and profits of their restaurant. It's then revealed to us that Gus Fring is at this meeting as well. In this scene during Gus Fring's spiel where he lists the accomplishments and achievements quarter over quarter, year over year for Los Pollos Hermanos, it's then revealed to us that the head of the restaurant division at Madrigal, a callback all the way back to Season 5 of Breaking Bad, Episode 2 entitled Madrigal, the character of Peter Schuler, who we only saw in the cold opening scene of this episode, commit suicide following the police wanting to discuss with him and his involvement with Gus Fring following Gus Fring's death. We see Peter Schuler actually kill himself with a defibrillator. Of course, then following this, we then see Gus Fring at the hotel in Houston saying he's only staying the night. Then following Gus sort of putting away his belongings in very sort of Gus Fring fashion, we then see him knock on the door and it's opened by none other than Lydia Radar Quayle. Then following Gus entering the room, we then see Peter Schuler in there as well, sort of looking very distraught. Again, interestingly, the point of this scene appears to be to display to us the sort of fragile emotional state that Peter is in as a part of his role in this scheme with Gus Fring in respect to the Super Lab and Madrigal's involvement in regards to maybe embezzling and hiding money and moving money around. It sort of explains to us that Gus Fring was the sort of calming presence in Peter Schuler's life. Again, it's revealed to us that they knew each other back in Chile, a sort of unknown story that Gus tells Peter saying he's still the man in Chile who saved them when their backs were up against the wall. But anyway, this scene sort of really displaying to us that Gus was that calming nature in Peter's life in respect to this illicit activity he was involved in. And when Gus Fring was killed at the end of season 4 of Better Call Saul, it really explains why Peter could not put up with the emotional distress of this and decided to just take his own life. Very interesting in this scene as well, where we sort of see the super lab being discussed really pretty much for the first time in this episode in great detail since all the way back at the very beginning of the season. Again, the super lab was not seen at all this season, but it is discussed here. And based on this dialogue in this scene and the fact that this plot is still open-ended, I really feel the super lab is going to have to come into effect next season in season 6, where we see the final conclusion of the storyline on screen next season. Then following this, the next scene in this act then picks up back at Jimmy and Kim's apartment. Following them having some small talk regarding real estate listings and Kim leaving for work, we then see Jimmy receive a phone call from none other than Mike Ehrmantraut saying he needs to talk to him for a minute, in an interesting callback to the episode Dedicado a Max, where Saul needed help from Mike, and Mike saying he couldn't help him because he was in a tunnel. Again, pretty funny here where Saul says that he's in a tunnel right now, sort of feigning this by turning on the blender, saying that he can't help him right now. Of course, then following a knock at the door where Saul thinks Kim is returning because she forgot something, it's then revealed to us that Mike is at the door. So basically in this scene, it's revealed to us that Mike knows that Saul is representing Lalo, aka Jorge de Guzman. Of course, much to the surprise of Saul that Mike even knows this and asking him who Lalo is to him, without Mike revealing this information, saying that he needs him to get him out on bail. Saul telling Mike, you know what he did right, sort of understanding how difficult this will be. Of course, in this scene, we see Mike provide Saul with the necessary information that's going to be used in order to help Lalo have bail granted. And the culmination of this sort of storyline will finally be displayed to us in the final act of this episode. And this scene thus ending the third act in this episode. Then following this, the fourth and final act in this episode then picks up with Nacho Varga breaking into Los Pollos Hermanos to burn it down at the will of Lalo. It's then revealed that none other than Gus Fring is with him as well. Of course, the premise of the scene here is that in order for Gus to continue to play the long game against Lalo and the cartel, he needs Nacho to do Lalo's bidding in order for Nacho to continue to build the trust of Lalo for the benefit of Gus Fring. Of course, we see here while Nacho trashes the restaurant, we see Gus set up the frozen chicken in order to slide into the oil and thus create a fire that burns down the restaurant. Pretty cool here to see Gus Fring take part in this plot as well. Again, quite the dichotomy here where Gus is sort of a prideful businessman who takes pride in his business, sort of having to burn it down and destroy one of his restaurants in order to, like I said, play the long game against the cartel here. Then following this, the next scene in this act then picks up at the Bernalillo County Courthouse, where we see the Assistant District Attorney and Detective Tim Roberts sort of discussing the case. We then see them interrupted by none other than Saul enter their room, saying that he discovered about the private investigator that they hired in order to pervert justice. Of course, them not understanding what Saul is talking about here. Tim saying he's going to call the librarian. This then picks up in court, where during this hearing for Saul to hope to get Lalo granted bail, we see sort of Saul going over the parameters of this hearing, telling Lalo to act in such a way that doesn't sort of exude arrogance, sort of also discussing the sort of fake family that Saul is going to use here in order for him to establish that Lalo has ties to the local Albuquerque community. In this scene, we also see Lalo ask who is the family sitting on the other side of the courtroom. Saul saying that it has to be Fred Whalen's family. Lalo sort of questioning here, who is this person? Sort of to Saul's surprise, telling him that he's the guy who died at Travel Wire. Sort of surprised that Lalo doesn't know this. Lalo sort of dismissively understands and sort of doesn't really care, showing real no remorse or apathy for Fred or his family. Of course, this is of course juxtaposed with Saul's reaction in this scene. We're following him looking at Fred's family and just seeing the absolute distress on Fred's mother's face, of course, having to deal with the death of her son. We see Saul being very introspective here, almost sort of, in hindsight, we can sort of see him maybe grappling with some guilt in his head about what he's going to have to get Lalo off on bail here so that he can flee to Mexico, and that Fred's family is not going to get the justice they deserve. Saul sort of dealing with this internal guilt here in this scene. This is, of course, then juxtaposed with following this moment of introspection. Saul does exactly what he's supposed to do. He goes through the speech to get Lalo out on bail, telling them about the information that Mike gave him about this private investigator who was used to pervert justice and coach the state's only witness, tying Lalo to the murder scene. Also telling the judge that despite the district attorney's attempt to saying Lalo has no ties to the local Albuquerque community, thus denying him bail, Saul then tells the judge about his family, his fiance and children, and soon-to-be mother-in-law. So then following this scene culminates with the judge saying that based on the outstanding circumstances of the manipulation of the only witness tying Lalo to the murder scene, he says based on this, bail should be granted. Of course, him setting the bail here at $7 million based on the severity of the charges, much to Saul's initial chagrin. Here, following this, Saul apologizes to Lalo for the ridiculous amount of money that it's going to cost him to post bail. Of course, Lalo's saying, no problem, I can do that. Again, sort of a callback here to the episode entitled The Guy for This, where the little trivial amount of money of $8,000 that Saul requested for his legal services really pales in comparison to the amount of money that the cartel has access to when he knows they're about to post a $7 million bail for Lalo's freedom here. Again, at the end of the scene, Lalo says that while he can post this bail, he's going to need Saul to go pick it up, thus foreshadowing what is, in my opinion, probably the best episode of this entire season, the next episode entitled Bagman. I'm not just saying that. That's definitely probably my favorite episode of the entire season. Can't wait to review it next. This scene then follows with a continuation of after Saul exiting the courtroom, we see him looking at the assistant district attorney talking to Fred Whalen's family. Again, sort of, we can see Saul grappling with his emotions here, of this guilt of while he did his job and had Lalo granted bail, at the same time there's a sort of emotional distress that he has to deal with here. This is then interrupted by none other than Howard Hamlin saying hello to Jimmy while running to each other at the courthouse here. Howard then asked Jimmy if he's thought any more about that job offer. Jimmy's saying that he still needs some more time to think about it. Howard then, sort of understanding where Jimmy's coming from here, says, I've clearly upset you, job offers off the table. Jimmy sort of feigning sort of ignorance here, sort of not understanding what's going on, saying things are getting kind of awkward. This is kind of weird. Howard saying, you know what's weird? Offering a man a job and then having bowling balls thrown at your car, and then having prostitutes sent to your business lunch with Clifford Maine. Again, Jimmy sort of feigning ignorance here again, saying Howard sounds unhinged with these sort of ridiculous accusations. Howard, of course, knowing that Jimmy is lying here, telling Jimmy, I'm sorry you were in pain. This comment is then followed by a total outburst by Jimmy, aka Saul, here in this scene. Again, I can't do it justice describing the scene here, but basically Jimmy says the reason why he rejected the job is because it was too small. He doesn't want it. It's a bacterium, to use his own words. Sort of even going so far as to compare himself to a god in human clothing. I guess sort of saying HHM is nothing compared to the worlds I travel in with the cartel. Again, an unbelievable scene here. The acting, I can only imagine what it took for Bob Odenkirk to do this scene. I'm kind of curious how many takes it took. I mean, just the overt screaming and emotion that he projects here in the scene was really unbelievable to watch. Of course, while this sort of tirade is happening at Howard, I guess sort of being the bigger man here, just sort of walks away from this confrontation, not wanting to engage Jimmy here, just sort of walks out of the courtroom while Jimmy is absolutely screaming at him. Like I said, comparing himself to a god, saying that lightning bolts shoot from his fingertips. Unbelievable here, scene to watch in my opinion. Again, I can't really do it justice. You have to go back and watch this. This is one of the best scenes of this entire season. And so, yeah, following this sort of tirade ending, we see Jimmy sort of compose himself, maybe almost even surprising himself how out of hand this scene sort of got at the courthouse, him sort of just yelling at the top of his lungs in front of everyone. And like I said, following composing himself and almost acting like it never happened, we see him turn around and walk in the other direction, thus ending the final scene in this episode. So yeah, pretty great episode in my opinion. Definitely one of the best episodes of this entire season. I love the final 4 episodes of this season, like I said. Again, I'm no expert here, but Jimmy's outburst at the end of this scene sort of reminds me of the parable of the Greek god Hubris, to sort of, use a comparison that Jimmy made as himself to a god. But yeah, like I said, pretty amazing episode. So much happens here, so much foreshadowing for where the season is going to go in the final 3 episodes. Lots of setup here of all the different storylines that are happening over the course of the season. Like I said, can't wait to review the final 3 episodes prior to the premiere of Season 6 in just a few weeks from now. As always, my name is Anton Jackson. Thank you again so much for watching this video.